We're live.
Hold on.
Oh, there it
We
is.
are live. Yes, we're
Okay.
live. Huh.
Hey,
Okay.
friends. It's me, Carmen Schober. It's been forever since I've got to chat with my friend, Peter Anderson. We've had lots of fun conversations in the past. But for those of you who are new, maybe you don't know who we are, maybe you only know one of us. Like I said, my name's Carmen. I am a romance writer, Christian romance writer. I'm also the editor of Stasios, which is a cultural commentary site. We just do cover all kinds of news issues from the Christian perspective. That's how I met Peter. Peter read Stasios and reached out. Peter, tell everybody a little bit about you for those who might be like, oh, not familiar with Mr. Peter Anderson.
Yeah. Well, nice to see you. Thanks again for having
Yeah.
me on. So, my name is Peter Anderson. As some of the audiences watching on Sound Engagement, you'll know me pretty well. But I'm a therapist. I've been a therapist for over 12 years here in Massachusetts. Live in right outside Boston, and after I got my MDiv, I decided to become a therapist, and then fell in love with it. Over time, I started asking certain questions about what it means to help people and how people really change. So started changing some of my original assumptions politically. I would say about 7 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago. And then I would say right around 2020, especially, that's when I got a lot more involved, seeing, how critical race theory, wokeness, all these really interesting, weird terms started just like taking over like wildfire. And so I started a podcast, and that's yeah, rest has been history. I could
Love it.
definitely elaborate more on that. So yeah.
No, that's perfect. I forgot that we are live and that this is primarily your audience. They already know. They
I
know
know.
you. This is for my people.
I'm
This is
so
for my
famous.
people.
Yeah, with our
Yeah,
100 and
and
something.
in my mind, I can't believe it's only been like a 6 year thing for you. I feel like you're very wise. I imagine many years of doing this in your life, but that speaks to your wisdom. Yeah, Peter and I have had lots of conversations now. We've talked about CRT. We've talked about, at one point, we talked about like disappointment, processing feelings of disappointment. Our initial conversation, I'm trying to remember what that was about. We've had 3 conversations now.
Yeah, I think the
That
first
very
one
first one.
was really based on therapy. Was
I
based
think
on,
that's right. Yeah,
yeah,
the
right.
Christian
What do you
approach
do
and
with
yeah.
someone that is really stuck in a lot of the wokeness? How do you talk to them? How do you
Yes.
have a conversation with them?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's right. That was a really good conversation.
that
It
was
feels
fun.
like it wasn't that long ago, but that was
No,
like 3 years ago.
oh my gosh, was it really 3 years? Yeah, I guess it was
Yeah.
2020.
Or like
Yeah,
2 or 3 years ago.
so
Well, today we're going to have a really fun conversation. I'm excited to learn from someone who knows a lot about marriage, counseling, relationships. I know what I know from personal experience. I've been married for 10 years. Definitely, I would say, I think every marriage is kind of like similar yet extraordinary. So I won't like offer any cliches other than like, experience the highs and lows, and definitely observed a lot of relationships in my life, in and outside of the church. I am a romance writer, so relationships are super interesting to me, particularly how they're depicted in art. And I want to kind of frame this thing I'm seeing as a romance writer for Peter, and I kind of want to get his take, and obviously would love to hear from other people, like in the comments and just response. But because what I was telling Peter before we went live is I feel confident about some of my observations, but some of it I feel like this is such an area that, like, on the one hand, a lot of people don't talk about. On the other hand, a lot of people say false things about relationships and romance and sex. On the other hand, there's just like just a discomfort about talking about it. So it's just a hard conversation, I think, for a lot of people to have. So hoping we're going to kind of open the door here a little bit for
yeah,
thinking about relationships in art and in real life.
looking
So
forward
with
to it.
that, I will say, so I wrote this romance novel. I think you've read it, Peter, or some of it, or
Yeah, most of it.
yes,
Yeah,
most of
right.
it.
It's good.
And
It's really good.
thank you,
It's
thank
fun.
you, thank
Yeah,
you. It's called
it's
After She
yeah.
Falls.
Hmm.
It's about a young woman. She wants to be a mixed martial artist. It's written as a little light homage to the classic Rocky movies, if you've ever seen it. And it fits within the Christian genre of clean. Like if you read a Christian fiction book, there's an expectation that it will be clean, meaning that there won't be like any graphic sex in it. There won't be any even like non-graphic sex. Like there just won't be. I think there is a gray area of like fade to black type of scenes, or if the couple is married, like there's some rules that you can break. But in general, like
I'd love to
the idea
know
is if you're
who
reading a
came up with
Christian
those.
romance. I know. Well, I remember I actually asked my publisher. I said, because
you know the Bible doesn't have any rape sex scenes in it ever.
No.
Yeah, at all. Yes,
exactly.
Right,
Well, the original version actually had cursing, quite a bit of cursing, because they're MMA fighters. So it was like, well, they're gonna curse. But I took it out. I finagled it. So instead of cursing, it just says like he cursed, she cursed. Anyway, I digress. I said, what are the like rules for sex in Christian publishing? And the gal wrote back and said, it's a gray area. Like cursing was like black and white, no cursing. Sex was a gray area, which I think, I think that's probably actually a good approach. I think some people would say that's controversial, but I think that like you take a story on its own merits and potentially based on how it's written in the context and all of that, I think it could be fine. Anyways, what I want to get into though is so with my book, some people felt like it was overly sexual and that it was like glamorizing being promiscuous or glamorizing lust or glamorizing just a non-Christian sex ethics, because some of the characters, like a lot of the characters, because they weren't Christians, like did engage in that. Like one of the main characters, Max, promiscuous guy, he was not a Christian for most of the book. The gal, the main character, like obviously tempted by him in various points of the novel. So I kind of got this response, and I won't say that it was definitely not the majority of readers, but just this little loud fringe that felt like basically thesis statement is this is dangerous. What people reading this is dangerous for them. This is going to make them feel certain things and want to do certain things. It's dangerous. And this was compounded by, while this was happening, the controversy surrounding redeeming love. I don't know if you saw any of that, Peter. That was...
Yeah, I know the controversy. Yeah. Even Ali Stuckey even had like a pretty sharp, which was a little disappointing. I'm sometimes, and I'm not like a hardcore Ali Stuckey fan, but I think she's a little too rigid in certain ways. But I think she's fantastic in like 95% of the,
I love her. Yeah, same. Well, a lot of people, like Sheologians, I actually got blocked on the Sheologians Facebook page, which I like Sheologians. I bought their book and I was shocked. I was just shocked by, like, for those who don't know, Redeeming Love is this best-selling Christian romance novel about a abused trafficked prostitute who marries a godly man, and he sort of slowly helps her heal. And it's based off of the book of Hosea in the Bible, but reimagined in, I think, like the 1800s in California is the idea. Anywho, it's
it's a beautiful story. Yeah,
it's really beautiful.
It really is.
Yeah. And the movie looked good. The movie actually looked like a Christian movie, well executed, like cinematic and dramatic and moving. And I thought the sex scenes were very tastefully done. I thought they were like as close to the line as you can probably get in a PG-13 movie with sexual elements, but nicely done. Again, just this really hyper angry response of people like, this is dangerous. People see this, they're gonna that's the question, right? It's like, it's so dangerous because why? I guess because people will lust, because people will stumble. That left me sort of reeling with, like, why is this sort of a small but consistent response from Christians to
Mhm.
sexual elements in art. And I would just, to kick things off, I'd just be curious your thoughts on that. Like,
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. In fact, well, also before I got my MFT degree, I was looking at studying a PhD in uh, basically, I was really fascinated in presuppositionalism and dispensationalism and how they had a very low image of God, which is really interesting because right after B.B. Warfield, and I studied this pretty extensively, definitely in seminary, Christians were on retreat after they were kicked out of Princeton. And so you have two different groups. You have Reformed, and then you have like the fundamentalists. Um, and the fundamentalists, like the Brethren, I was part of a Brethren church once. They kind of became your dispensational, extremely rigid type of believers that started believing in dispensationalism that kind of had this separate view of the world. And then you had Reformed believers like Cornelius Van Til and others who would say that we're not to be separate of the world, but their view of they still thought that you were to kind of retreat. And so in the early 1900s, Christians were basically in retreat. And ever since, I believe, in the past 100 years, we've been retreating from the world, not engaging in the world. Now there have been elements of that where I think there have been other people that have been trying to engage the world, but it's still kind of from a quote Christian worldview. But if you contrast that from 1800 years of history, Christians were never like that. If you read Christian, I mean, Mozart, Shakespeare, we were responsible for some of the most beautiful buildings, some of the most engaging scientific methods for thousands of years, until around the 1920s, actually. Christians were expected to know law. They were expected to know every element of, study. Your pastor was actually right up there with your lawyer as well as your doctor, as far as how well informed he was with cultural issues. This is back in the 1800s. So they were extremely cognizant of new philosophical worldviews that were coming up. That's just not the case anymore. And so Francis Schaeffer was really kind of concerned about that. So he wrote in his book, I have his collection, how Christians ever since then have been like way behind the rest of the culture. And so rather than engaging the culture, we've just been, 20 steps behind. And I think you see that. I think that's why we talk about wokeness, why a lot of believers have just been kind of, swept up with it. I wasn't really swept up with it because I studied like early 1960 postmodern philosophy. I'm minored in philosophy in undergrad. So I think there's this kind of retreatist mentality. It's been engaged in the church that has taken this view that this is, quote, Christian and this is, quote, worldly. I don't take that view at all. One of my favorite movies is No Country for Old Men, because I actually think, and I just watched the Kurt Warner movie recently. As much as I liked it, I thought it was fun. You contrast No Country for Old Men with Kurt Warner's movie. No Country for Old Men is vastly more biblical than the Kurt Warner movie. The Kurt Warner movie is, if you try really hard, and you stay with your dreams, you might go to the Super Bowl. And it was good. It was good. There are exceptions, but that just doesn't happen. Whereas No Country for Old Men, which won the Pulitzer Prize, it's an ecclesiastical version of what life is without God. And it's what Christians were often called to do before this kind of retreatist mentality was not to have this ersatz kind of fake view of what our ideal was, Romans 8:28 theology. It was an ecclesiastical view, not ecclesiastical, but from the book of Ecclesiastes. It was an honest, cathartic view of what the world was really like. And Christians were so much more engaged with that sense of catharsis and with that sense of suffering. Life is pain. Life has despair. And I think there's kind of like this insecure, I guess, progression that's, been brought on with a lot of the Christian church, both Reformed and fundamentalist, that has, I think, stayed with us ever since. That we're almost like uncomfortable with honesty. Like we're okay talking about the resurrection, but we're not okay talking about the death of Christ. I mean, that's what Flannery Rutledge talks about in her wonderful book, The Crucifixion of Christ. It's like we're almost really, we don't know what to do in people's pain. And we want to rush right to like Romans 8:28 theology. And the reason why I bring up Romans 8:28 theology is because a lot of Christians will quote that verse whenever someone's in pain, and they completely take it out of context. Romans 8:28 is an not ecclesiastical, but it's an eschatological view of like where we'll eventually be, where Christians never really used that when people were in pain. They would use the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Psalms, Song of Solomon, talking about sex, so, I mean, they would bring these kind of dark passages, and they were okay with that. And that's where I think there's, it's kind of interesting, because I think it's been going on for a long time, which has also led to this kind of censorship mentality that it's still prevalent even today in secular circles, that says that if we cancel somehow, like when you said earlier, it's dangerous, that if we cancel certain people, then somehow these false views just won't necessarily prop itself up, which is just actually it's quite the opposite. Not to diverge too much, but there's a great book by Hugo Messier called Not Born Yesterday, where he talks about that the more you censor, or the more you compartmentalize things that may be dangerous, the more you actually create kind of a counterculture that becomes really rigid in their own beliefs and their own biases. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, it's fascinating book that at the end of the day, psychologically, it just doesn't work. It's quite the opposite. That it's actually much better to have conversations, which is why even politically, I still don't identify myself as a pure Republican or a pure Democrat. I still identify myself as a pure classical liberal, because I truly believe that the foundation of a good society is when we can, for me, it's free speech. Free speech is everything to me. Right. Even, regarding everything, if you want to convince somebody that abortion is wrong, you have to start with free speech. Otherwise, good luck with that. It has to, for me, that's the foundation of what makes our society, what's going to make any society great, is the expression of different ideas. That's why I still see myself as a classical liberal in that way. So, yeah.
I mean, I think that speaks to the issue. This is reminding me, I had a conversation with John Branyan. That was probably like a year ago. He's a Christian comedian, and he gets a lot of flack for things, because he'll say, some controversial stuff. Right. We were talking about something similar, and he basically said, a lot of people in the church, similar to this correlation you drew between like canceling things on the left, it's like, if we don't talk about it, or if we don't acknowledge it, people will stop caring about it. And that's just not how it works. Like, I mean, I think we see it in this approach of like, if Christian parents or the church don't want to talk about sex and romance and relationships, things that, of teenagers of a certain age are interested in, they're not going to stop. They're not going to not be interested in it just because people aren't talking about it. You know what I mean? Like, it will still, the desire for information and knowledge and experience will still exist, even if it becomes taboo. And like I think what you were getting at, it can take on like a much more possibly unhealthy obsession with it if it's becoming taboo. Because, if you feel like you're being blocked from information, if you feel like you're purposefully being cut off from something you want to learn about, that's just going to fuel you to look for information elsewhere. And then, like you said, it's probably going to lock in certain biases or whatever the case may be. Whereas just like, instead of this approach of like, that is dangerous, don't you dare look at that, don't you dare read that, like, instead of that, I mean, you've just made that thing become you've given it all this power, kind of like maybe it had, but maybe it didn't. Like the argument I've made with redeeming love, people freaking out about it, it's like, they'll say stuff like, oh, a young woman's going to read that book and she's going to get all stirred up. She's going to have all these longings for romance. And my response is like, I mean,
Because it's not puberty. It's not puberty. It's a book. Yeah,
I
just
don't
let you
want
know. Yeah.
9-year-olds to read it, but like, okay,
I don't know. Maybe.
your average 15-year-old or something, like she already has
kidding.
romantic longings. What are
Sure.
you talking about? And like, why are we pretending like that's dangerous? Like, obviously, I mean, certain choices that one makes could be dangerous, but just the experience of being human and having the feeling is dangerous.
I know. And there's no elaboration of terms. Like your book, I think some of the critiques, I remember reading some of the critiques, and it was like there are too many bar scenes. There's too many like she's swooning, your main character, Adria, is like, swooning her hips in a few times. How dare you? But if you know how to read a book, let's just talk about, I want to get even more basic. If you don't know how to read a book, then sure, maybe you'll take certain scenes and you will take a microscope and expound on a teeny tiny little passage. But let's just talk about basic reading. I mean, your book had nothing to do with that. Your book had so much more to do with like redemption. Redemption was beautiful. It was an honest look of suffering and redemption out of suffering with a woman that was beaten up quite a bit. And you got really in depth with her abuser. And I loved how you, as somebody that actually has counseled a lot of women who were abused, I felt like I really related to her because she still had a longing for her former, lover or, husband So, I mean, I loved how you brought that up a lot. I thought you got the psychological underpinnings. You're spot on. And
thank you.
That's just life. Life is pain, and it's not like, well, what's dangerous to talk about it, to admit that life is this way. And if you're immediately saying, well, that's dangerous, well, are you in denial that life does have that? And if so, then what does that say about why we need help, why we need a savior, why we need, why we need community, why we need, to rescue? I just don't. I'm right there with you. I mean, as somebody that has lost people a lot, losing my mother to cancer, and and having friends that have, I've also had some grief in other areas of my life. I hate to say this, but I don't often go to my Christian friends all the time. I have lately, because I found some really good Christian groups of friends who just know how to sit with pain. And I think as a therapist, that's actually the number one reason why I wanted to become a therapist. I wanted to be a Christian that was just okay sitting with a woman whose husband just left her for another person and not having answers with her or for her. I mean, I've sat with people in my office who lost their children. And as somebody, we both have 3 kids. I would be in a dark place, Carmen, if I lost one of my little babies. I just would. And I'm not going to lie. I mean, I would be dark. It would be dark. And I don't feel shame by saying that. It would be bad. And I would need a lot of help, by people to lift me up from that. I don't even try to even go there mentally, but I've sat with that type of pain, and it's daunting. And it's like, and I remember with one person in particular, she had, she had lost her 8-year-old little boy, and just suddenly within a week. And this isn't me praising myself or anything, but I just had no answers for her at all. And I spent about more than 9 months just sitting with her and just, I would weep in sessions. I couldn't help the tears, right? I mean, when you're describing that, this beautiful little boy, and then he's gone. And when she left and she moved, she just like, thank you. And I was like, why? I didn't even counsel you. And she was like, no, I just got to process that. Thank you. And I think, that's the incarnation. That's what I think we're called to do. And I think,
sorry, just because I don't want to forget it. What you're saying, super poignant. I think what a lot of people miss about art is that art is an experiment in that. Like, you're doing it in real life. Like, this really happened to that woman, and you're really there. You're really the person that is sitting with her and experiencing, some tiny little degree of the suffering with her. And in art, we can explore that without having to have the tragedy, right? Or the terrible mistake, depending on what the story is about, right? And I think that that's a really amazing thing about art, right? Because we don't all we're not all going to experience
Absolutely.
the same
Wow.
things, we're not all going to go through the same trials. We're not going to experience the same kind of suffering. We're not going to have the same kinds of temptations. We're just not. But through art, it's like this, in a kind of ironic to what we're discussing, a safe way to experience it, right? Because you're not, what I mean by safe is just that, it's not actually happening to you. You're not actually,
Right.
you're
Yeah.
not losing anything necessarily. You're not, but in a way, you're getting as close to that as you possibly can in good art. Good art is going to get you as close to the real thing as it possibly can. And so I don't know,
Yeah.
just came to
That's
me as you're
beautiful. Yeah.
describing this, this,
Yeah.
the importance of just being able to sit in suffering, or to sit with people who are in the middle of things, right? I think that's kind of
Yeah.
speaks to what you were saying before. Not this idealized perfect state, because we're not there, in the
Mm.
middle of the mess. That's where we are, we are.
Right.
And if Christian art can't touch that, if that's dangerous, then we can't have Christian art, like.
Well, in my opinion, it's not even art. It's kind of like, I mean, I don't know if there's been really good art for years. When I refuse to go to modern art museums because I don't really
Oh yeah.
consider that art.
Yeah, a toilet or
I
whatever.
mean, thankfully we have a really wonderful MFA up here, and you can kind of ignore that part. I mean, but it's just, I know it's so funny. I went through like the Greek section and the Roman section, and then went to I got to see some of these beautiful American pieces, George Washington. Then we passed the American art scene, and it was like all this like critical race theory and like these neon lights, and it was like very ugly. And it was just like the contrast between beauty. Anyway, no, but I mean, I think art, there's an element of beauty there too. And beauty is only set when it's in contrast with the, I guess, the broken, and there's a sense of, I'm comfortable with honesty. Like one of the things I help a lot of guys with sex addiction, for example. The reason why and I'll veer this into how it's all related. Their sex addiction is really rooted into a denial of reality by trying to fill in a void inside their heart that they can't ever satisfy. In other words, they go into these kind of shame cycles of, spiraling because they're in a sense like having this prototype or this ideal that has nothing to do with what they're actually suffering with internally. And they try to compensate that or replace that with something that's just like very temporary. Brutal honesty is the very thing that they need, especially not just with guys with sex addiction, but also with really any addiction. When you look at any addiction, alcohol, my guys that suffer, the people that I counsel with alcohol addiction, it could be porn addiction, it could be whatever. What is addiction? I mean, addiction is really our desire to kind of escape because there's a part of us that doesn't want to look at a part of us that feels shame. And, and we listen to that part way too much. And we often have another part of us that gets really managerial and really very, very, very rigid. And it tries to fix all of that. And I think that's where a lot of these kind of Christian Puritans are coming from. It's kind of the opposite of maybe escaping through addiction. Let's just be really, really careful. And let's have like a really rigid diet, for example. And then our eating disorder will never come. Well, the eating disorder keeps coming because you still think you're fat, right? You still have that open wound that is telling you you're a failure. And so, yeah, sure, you could listen to this part for a moment that says, let's go into this sex addiction or this addiction right over here. But the release to that is not to listen to the other part that says, let's be overly rigid and never look and never taste, never touch, which I think is what Paul is talking about in Philippians. Those things don't actually satisfy us. And then he brings in the gospel, touch not, taste not, satisfy, handle not, which will never bring, as he says in the context of that passage, true sanctification. And then he brings in the beauty of the cross. And so it's like, that won't fix it. So contrary to what people are saying maybe about your book or I get it. I think it's a reaction because they're afraid that if they don't do this, then you will do this. But the problem is you play that back and forth for the rest of your life because you haven't really dealt with the actual wound. Yeah. And I think when it comes to art is just secure in that. And this is what I liked about your book. You were secure about all of those elements and you presented it to the reader. And then here's redemption, which is really great. So I don't know. Yeah. who, yeah, when your main character was moving her hips, the last thing I was thinking of was right. I was like, what in the world?
That's so
When I
funny.
read the criticism, I was like, that's the last thing I was talking about. And it's kind of like, yeah, it makes me immediately, if I could apply a little bit of Freudianism here, it's like the people that are most jealous of their partner are usually the ones that are like maybe thinking of cheating on their partner. Anyway, so not to get too Freudian. So
Oh,
it's
wow.
little
That's
FYI. So
interesting.
usually
Yeah.
the ones that are overly jealous are usually the ones that are probably thinking. So
Huh,
anyway, so
huh.
yeah, that's neither here or there, but that was my
Wow.
first thought.
That's super deep. I don't know that much about therapy, so you just like blew my mind.
Oh, right.
I do see
Okay.
that, it is this sort of these two extremes that you can just hang out in and not actually accomplish anything. Like one thing
Yeah.
I have said
Mm.
in trying to, I will say this because I think it's important. I have dogged on the fundamentalists a lot lately. One, because I don't like how they treated my book, but two, I think they deserve it. Three, though,
Right.
I will say, I do not think they are like this powerful, dominant voice nearly as much as the, I guess in Christian terms, we would call it like the licentious folks. I think that's a much more popular take is, do whatever you want, uh, don't let people judge you. I feel like that refrain is more popular than like the dogmatic one. However, um, they're both obviously terrible, counterproductive. I see the fundamentalist overreaction to things like a character swaying her hips or something like that, coming from this place of, I'd be interested in your perspective as a therapist if you think this is true. I think they look out and they see the cultural landscape. And it's kind of horrifying, right? Like just the trends of promiscuity, the trends of immodesty, divorce, just all these things, just sex addiction, porn addiction, abuse. You look out and it just doesn't look good.
Yeah. Right.
I think they see this and they're just totally overwhelmed by how could I possibly change this or fix this or uh, influence people, affect change. And it's so overwhelming. And the level of boldness required to really like make a wave, like an important wave in one of those areas, they don't have it. They don't have that boldness or that confidence. So that's why they hyper focus on this tiny thing, this swaying hips. I'll get mad about this paragraph in a book and say that it's dangerous. I'll fight this little battle because it's pretty low stakes at the end of the day. And I won't go
Right. Yeah.
fight, rampant gender fluid theory in the school
Hmm.
system. I won't speak up and
Interesting.
fight
Yeah.
with my
Right.
uh not fight. I won't challenge, a family member on some belief that they have. Instead, I will attack this small thing. I don't know. That's a
Right.
take that I have is that it's just
Yeah.
overwhelming. Therefore, you pick the easier battle.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's kind of an easy fix in the sense, like, I mean, I deal with that a lot as a therapist. And one of the things I do, John Gottman has a really, really good exercise on compromise.
Hmm.
The reason why we become overly rigid on like what color the garage needs to be is because you haven't stated with your partner what your core need is. And if you could start with your core need, you actually become a whole lot more flexible in things that really don't matter
Mhm.
and very, in a good way, opinionated about your voice. I think at the end of the day, I think a lot of it, I can only speak for individuals,
Right.
that most individuals that I speak to or families I speak to, the reason why they're nitpicking everything is because they haven't actually stated what their core need is,
Mhm.
which is actually the most difficult thing in communication. I feel about what I need. We often focus way too much about feelings, which causes us to make us maybe be way too naggy, or maybe we're focusing too much on complaints. But we often leave out the need part. And I think there's an element of evangelicalism that doesn't have always the best boundaries. We feel bad for saying that. We don't really know what assertiveness is. So we go through these pendulum shifts between like being doormats as men and being overly aggressive or like
Mhm.
nitpicking every little teeny tiny weensy thing your wife does. That's
Oh,
just as insecure as the guy that's just like a doormat. It's just you're covering up your insecurity because you're not actually stating what your core need is. And so that's why men and women, we're all guilty of this. That's doesn't matter on your gender. But I think with that, I think I would just say, what's your core need and how are you achieving that? And if it's purity, okay, well, how do you play that out? Is it purity? I mean, I don't know. I mean, is it a reaction? Is it if somebody keeps saying, well, it's dangerous, they're not really telling me anything. You know what I mean? It's just like, well, you're describing it, you're diagnosing, but you're not actually telling me where your vulnerabilities are. Are you scared? Yeah, I'm scared. Oh, okay. Well, now we're getting somewhere. What are you scared of? Well, I'm scared if I read this passage, I may I don't know, my daughter may want to sway her hips that way. Okay. Tell me more about that.
Right.
Well, I did that and I lost my virginity at 13. Oh, okay. When was that? Yeah, I was at a camp and my dad wasn't actually around. Okay. Now you're getting somewhere. I mean, I think that's where I would just be like, I think I would nitpick a little bit on what your core need is and just like kind of elaborate. I'm teaching you how to be a therapist, Carmen. You're welcome.
Right. I know.
Right.
So the romance novels don't work out. Watch out,
Right.
guys.
Yeah. No, but it's like, are you diagnosing? It's diagnosing the problem isn't really telling you what the problem is for yourself, and I think we have to start with I think you could get somewhere with it if it's actually legitimately fear. Like, is it a reaction against some of the feminist movement that seems to never be satisfied unless all the girls are masculine? Which actually makes a lot of sense. You want to bring back masculinity. Okay, well, anyway,
yeah, that's super interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, man, I'm learning stuff. Let me see. We've brought up a lot of things. I want to figure out what I want to get your perspective on because there's a lot here. Since you just talked about masculinity, one of my claims that I make frequently is I think that many problems could potentially be resolved, not completely resolved, but move in a positive direction if more men knew what like healthy masculinity was and felt sort of supported in pursuing it, because I don't see that very often, like, especially, unfortunately, I don't see it very often, even in the Christian church. I think in some Christian cultures, it's going better than others. I think there is like a renewed interest in masculinity. I've just seen in sort of the books that are coming out and stuff, which I think is great. Right. But I just see this sort of, I think there's like these two options that are presented to men very often. And it's sort of like this, if you're going to be a Christian man, then you need to be extremely agreeable, extremely passive, extremely, I guess I should say there's two options presented for Christian men. And then I see the option for secular men. Basically, you can be, like you were talking about, that really rigid, nitpicky man who wants his wife to always have her ankles covered up and dinner better be ready and, blah, blah, blah. Or the super passive beta male. And then for secular men, I think there's either like the super feminized male feminist or the red pill guy, which for those who aren't familiar, it's sort of like just this ultra
incels that they're called and stuff like that. Yeah, sure,
yes,
whatever. Yeah,
yes.
Or that's the derogatory name.
That's the derogatory. Basically, the idea being like in the red pill community that men should really only kind of look out for themselves. The only reason they should learn about female nature is to basically use it for their advantage, for their pleasure, for their comfort, and that's kind of it. Like, that's the extent of it. And if it works out and you get a companion, great. But at the end of the day, all that really matters is that you as a man are not used by a woman. She doesn't drain your resources. She's not a nag to you. You get what you want. That's kind of that like ultra selfish, hedonistic, individualistic reaction to feminism, which is interesting because feminism's kind of the female version. Like, it's like, these two. So I would just be curious. I mean, do you agree with that? Do you think that healthy masculinity would be like this amazing? I mean, I don't know. I guess as I see it is, I think that it would just change so many dynamics. I think so many dynamics are broken because of broken masculinity. And I mean,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
So just let you know.
No, and I would really encourage your audience, my audience too. The best book on masculinity I've ever read was uh, Raising Cain, and you could watch it on PBS, and it just talks about boys and the number one reason why boys fall into crime. The number one reason, so it goes way back to childhood when we got rid of recess. Boys are very physical, and boys also learn through example, which is often why women who are overly empathetic will never change a man, because she thinks that by lecturing him and thinking that he will eventually come to this an aha moment, it just never achieves, because she's using the wrong approach. He only changes when she literally walks out the door and says, I'm leaving with the kids. And he says, oh my gosh, what did I just do? So there's something about the male brain that I think is very literal at times, but also it's Vygotsky, the child psychologist, often talked about the zone of proximal development, that men are very attuned to that in the sense that we need examples. I even have a hard time myself, because what is masculinity? Is preparing for this interview, I'd have to really think about that, because is it just like not being female, or is it just having, well, what are manly traits? Because I have a son who may watch this interview 15 years from now, and maybe he'll be embarrassed, but he's very tender, and he's very sweet, he's very kind, and he's soft spoken. Does that mean he's not manly? And I get kind of frustrated with certain people. I won't name names here, but they almost like put traits up there, like these are quote masculine traits,
like a personality trait.
Yeah, and I just totally disagree with that. I think there are a lot of very strong men who are introverts and feelers and soft spoken, but they're brave, and I think when it comes to, like, as I was preparing for this, what is my ultimate calling as a man? My ultimate calling is to be a provider and to be a protector for my family. At the end of the day, that's my core need. And there's a really good Netflix series on, it's called, I can't remember it, but it's on animals. And it just came out recently. And it talks about how, like, the male lion, and the male lion he's not always the most kind. He eats too much of the food, and he kind of hits the other cubs, and he's really lazy. But the reason why he eats so much food is because whenever he sees other male lions coming, those male lions actually want to devour his children and mate with all of his quote wives. Now, obviously, we don't have multiple wives, at least not in these days. But I love that.
Give it 5 years.
I know, yeah, right. Or become Mormon. But I mean, or polyamory is getting a huge. But I love that, because I was just thinking about that. Like, that's my calling. Maybe not to act that way, but I need to be on alert for people and things and ideas that want to literally devour my kids. And you look at the story of Pinocchio, which is my favorite Disney film. And Pinocchio, all the kids go on Pleasure Island. And it's really fascinating, because those kids, they don't really talk about in the book, they don't really talk about their dads. They talk about their overprotective moms. And they're in the island, and they become donkeys, and the parents will never see them again. And they give them everything what they want. And that's really fascinating to me, because with the absence of the father, the naivete of men being aware of the dangers that are around them is the biggest neglect that men have today. Is because we become so passive or so overly aggressive that we lose all of our energy. So the reason why I bring up male lions is because they don't waste their energy on just like stupid things. They eat all the food, they relax, they're not lazy. They're preserving their energy to wait until that dangerous thing comes along so they can attack and protect their tribe.
Yeah.
And there's an element of that when men become so nitpicky, you are exerting so much of your energy at the dangers that are literally right around your family. And you need to be, not that you can't have opinions, but it's not about soft-spokenness or firmness and all this other stuff. It's about, what is my ultimate calling? And I have to admit, I have to make a confession here. I've said a lot of things to my wife that haven't always been kind, everything else. The worst thing that I've ever said to my wife, was when I said to her, when I was really feeling depressed, I don't think I could be a leader because I don't know how to do it. That was the worst thing I've ever said to my wife, Bethany, because it was an evasion of my own responsibility and I was diverting it back to her. And I look back at that and I think at the time of I think of like Revelation, the people that will receive judgment. It's not the adulterers and the murderers. Yes, they will receive it as well. The top of the list in Revelation is cowards. And it's just like, when I said that to her, I was being a coward because I was evading my responsibility and giving it back to her rather than being acutely aware of the danger that may be around me. And I think like true masculinity is being alert to that. It's not being nitpicky and over opinionated about every single teeny tiny weensy thing, nor being overly passive. It's being aware of like, there might be something out there that might want to devour. I'm going to call it the bullshit. And I'm going to be like, hey, no, this isn't good. And that's the thing I was reading scripture a little bit. I mean, there are two things about female sin and male sin. And I hope this doesn't sound condescending, but I think the female sin, according to scripture, is gullibility. And you see that with women, that because you have this child, you have so much empathy as women, and women can often be overly gullible. They can, just like, because they let a lot of their empathy.
You don't have to convince me.
Driving that. I know you're not.
My whole life.
And that's just like,
years, baby.
Yeah. And that's just, clinically, I think I see that quite a bit, even with my non-believing, that they allow way too much of their empathy kind of to lead them. Men are kind of the opposite, where they let their eyes lead them way too much. And this is why sometimes men will be guilty of objectivization or whatnot, and not be led to kind of like an idea while they're led with their eyes, which is why sometimes men can be if a sanctified man is very good with boundaries, is like, no, I'm not going to worry about this, but this is wrong, and we need to get him out of the congregation. And I think of like, not to bring up Disney again, because I'm bringing old school Disney, but like even like Lion King, for example, and Jordan Peterson brings this up. It's a really good quote on Lion King, that when you think of Lion King, Simba wants to evade his responsibility. And the main reason why he wants to evade his responsibility is, thinking about that, his dad was kind of being pretty naive about Scar. Scar never actually showed up to the ceremony. That's like a big kind of like a middle finger to everything that he wants to establish. What his dad really should have done has been like, you need to go. And he was a threat. And Simba is very naive, and he doesn't even believe that Scar might have really bad motivations. And it had to kind of come to a kind of a bad realization, because I love James Earl Jones and I love the dad lion so much.
Yeah.
But the one tiny fault that he had is that he was overly naive about Scar, which led to Simba going off and living all this guilt and becoming a vegetarian and totally like, being what he was never meant to be. And those are the passive men. Until he comes back and faces his own demons, he can overcome the very thing that's actually evil in his tribe. Yeah. And so what men are called to do is to see that, and not to let their empathy control them.
Sorry,
but to be like,
did you say that?
That was my Siri. Sorry, Siri said that. But not to let their overemphasis of empathy control their drive, and to be like, no, you're not taking over this family. And it doesn't have to be aggressive. It doesn't have to be passive, but it needs to be assertive. And that is something that's just taught. That's something you can't conjure up.
Yeah.
Well, I should say it's prone by example. It's by proxy, I guess I should say that. But I mean, I'm not there yet, but I'm striving to be there. And I think that's where, that's what we're called to do. And I like that, because it's like, it frees me up, but it also goodness, it gives me a heck of a lot of responsibility.
Yeah.
It does both.
Yes.
It's kind of like makes me breathe in one area and be like, Peter, you better be on edge. It's like,
I like that definition a lot, because I do struggle a little bit myself with, like, because I am interested in art, right? I have to kind of assign an aesthetic to masculinity. I just have to, like, you have to when you're creating characters, and to femininity. And I tend to be pretty classical. I like my characters to be very good looking and heroic and all of that. But when talking about these things, you're right that it's not, masculinity and femininity should not be reduced to this like simple aesthetic of, masculinity is aggressive, femininity is gentle. Like, it's just not that
it's
binary.
Not that simple.
It's not that simple. But I do like that you have pinpointed a real specific non-abstract thing, which is protectiveness that results in taking responsibility. If I would sum up what you're describing, that was like sort of the masculine essence, is sensing, seeing, being aware of the danger and taking responsibility to whatever degree you are supposed to take responsibility for. If you have a family, obviously that looks different than if you don't or whatever, but to whatever certain extent, recognizing that and taking action. You might be interested just in this little tidbit, like, since you're teaching me about therapy, I'll teach you about romance writing.
Please, yes.
The only rules for creating masculine heroes are that, well, there's multiple rules, but the only big rules are that he needs to be protective to a certain extent, not overly protective, but he should care. Kind of exactly what you're describing. He's got to care. He's got to care about other people. He's got to care. He can't just care about himself. And he especially needs to care about people who need help. Like there's always some point in every book, movie, whatever, where the hero is going to do something for someone more vulnerable than him. And that will make you bond with that person. But the other thing that, I don't know if you want to psychoanalyze this, is that they have to be exceptional in some way. They don't have to be exceptional in all the ways or in like a stereotypical way, but essentially a male hero, in order for women to desire him, for him to be praiseworthy, he has to be exceptionally blank, whether that's exceptional in some career field, exceptionally smart, exceptionally strategic, exceptionally whatever. Basically, every male hero has something, which I wonder if that just speaks to what you were saying of that like sense of men. I think personally in observations, I see that men tend to be most fulfilled and confident when they are pursuing something challenging. I don't know very many men who are, if their approach is, I can do the bare minimum, who also happen to be happy. Like that's just a rare find. Or I guess I should say, I do know men who do the bare minimum and they seem happy, but they're not terribly admirable,
Right. Yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Think anything interesting?
I would definitely take some qualms with he has to be exceptional in things, because I think what's more important is that he has to be overly honest about his own failures. I would
humble.
say, humble. And I mean, there's a difference between self-concept and self-esteem. Self-concept is actually being okay with your limitations and not trying to be what you're not. I felt like I really grew in my own manhood when I reached that point. It's like, Peter, you're actually not going to be this. It's okay to be this. And that's actually okay. And I felt comfortable in my own skin. Think of a comedian versus that insecure, creepy guy at the coffee shop. The comedian is actually comfortable with his insecurities. The creepy guy is not. And it's just weird. If you've ever been on a date before you met your husband, ever went on like a date, he's just not comfortable with his insecurities. It's just really kind of awkward. Mm-hmm. The guy that makes you laugh is totally comfortable with his insecurities and he makes you laugh. So it's not so much that he's exceptional, like he's like this amazing person, as much as like he's okay at his own limitations, which, going back to honesty, makes you see the scars out there a lot easier because you're honest with yourself. I mean, the whole point of being a provider and being a protector is that I have to be honest with myself. I have to see my own limitations and not try to let my own, drive for success that isn't rooted in my love for God or marriage, like dictate my own desire to take a back seat at times and be okay with that, because it's not necessarily about me in the moment. And so that's manhood for me, and that's that sense of, because going back to the lion, he's preserving his energy, because when danger does come, because people who are highly self-aware with their own insecurities and their vulnerabilities and just like okay with that, but they still want to strive to get better, can also call BS a lot easier because they've kind of been there, and they don't let that blind spot overtake them. And those are, And that's actually, that's the Shakespeare always has like the villains stop listening to the fool. Like in King Lear, when he truly goes insane, the fool gets cast out in a lot of ways, or like, Lear stops listening to him. In the beginning, he's like they're friends, but there's a shift in Act 4 where he just basically the fool's kind of on his own and he has no conversations with Lear anymore, and that's truly where Lear becomes insane. And it's like the fool is meant to kind of point out all his faults, and Lear laughs quite a bit in Act 1. He's like he's somewhat okay. Maybe I was too hard on my daughter. Okay, yeah, okay. Well, let me think about this maybe in a different way. And that's like you see some flexibility there. It's only when the fool is cast out, he stops listening to him, that he kind of spirals. And I think I like that because that also allows a man to be gentle when he needs to be tender with his children, who are highly vulnerable and not exceptional whatsoever. And he walks with them in their progress, and they learn very differently because they see learning as an opportunity for change, but not as an opportunity that I have to be at some like fixed point, which often create, again, those shame cycles again, which is why people often have a very difficult time changing. So, I mean, I guess I would redefine and kind of tweak it, but not that, I don't know if I could write a Christian novel. I guess that's what you just told me.
Well, no, right. I like what basically you're giving it, you're basically bringing a Christian element to it, right? So, this sort of brings us back to the conversation on sort of the red pill stuff is, so the reason why in romance writing, you got to have, like, he's got to be protective, he's got to be exceptional.
Sure.
They're just playing off of, like, it's the widest net, right? Like, what are the characteristics that the majority of readers are going to find attractive? And obviously, like, in men, women, to a certain extent, find like success attractive.
That's true.
Like,
yes,
it's like true. Anthropological.
True.
It's that, like, there's just who's basically, the question is like coming from sort of our like instinctual nature of who's going to keep me safe, who's going to keep me the safest, the guy with the resources, the guy who's good with a sword, like, like
well, that's funny you say that, because women, they actually did brain scans about 4 years ago, and it kind of threw off all the feminist movement, because they actually did brain scans on heterosexual women that were highly turned on. It was the Marlon Brandos. It was all the it was all the quote toxic men that all the feminists have been trying to, like. It's a study that actually, it was published. I can't remember which school that did it, but they did brain scans on something like 50. It was a lot of heterosexual women that would not have identified as conservatives. They were most turned on when they saw the scenes of like Brando and Streetcar Named Desire and like the tough guy. What is that? So, I mean, I think you're right. Yes, I do think there's what do you do?
So here, this could be right. This could be a good sort of concluding little thing for us.
That's it's totally different little fun little conversation we could have.
Well, what I think a cool challenge for Christian art is, like, let's acknowledge that reality. Let's acknowledge that as human beings, we are wired to want certain things. We're wired to feel certain things. So it's not automatically bad. It's not automatically problematic. It easily could become that way, especially in modernity. There's lots of ways it can go bad. But I think personally, I mean, it's kind of been a little passion project of mine, is to try to mainstream really healthy masculinity in Christianity. And one of the things I was trying to do in After She Falls, and what I'm trying to do in my next book, is present these kind of unexpected male Christian heroes that embody this sort of Marlon Brando-iness. Like, they're physically fit, they're basically just that sort of aggressive male, not like aggressive point where it crosses a line, but aggressive, a man that your average woman is going to find very attractive, who also gets in touch with some of the things you're describing, that humility, that self-awareness, that, like you're saying, self-concept, being able to basically bring those two things together. And I don't know if you think that's a a worthwhile
I love that.
exercise.
I love that.
You love it? Okay. I don't know if I'm
I love it.
painting
I think that's great.
a false
I think
expectation
that's
for everybody.
fantastic.
The perfect man.
Yes. Yeah. I used to
But
tell my wife, I used to joke with her when I was an early therapist, and I used to text her. I said, "Well, babe, I made a really strong grown man cry again today," and she would just laugh. And I used to love that. Those are
yeah,
my favorite sessions when I have like this big tough guy, and he's like,
yeah,
"Oh my gosh," I love
yeah,
those sessions. Oh man,
yeah,
I just want to give him a hug. No, I think that's fantastic. I think
yeah,
it's fantastic. Well, because what you're doing is that you're creating the conflict inside of himself, and you're being honest and raw about that, how he presents versus, the prototype that he feels pressured to do, but also all these parts that are, what does he do with that? And
mhm,
is there a way to release that while also kind of, it's not easy. It's not easy
right,
being a man.
right.
Not to,
No.
it's just not. It's
Well,
not in
and
a, especially a
no,
cis white male, whatever that's supposed to mean.
in 2022.
2022.
What you were saying about art earlier, modernity loves ugliness. Oh my gosh. Like they just love subversion. I say they, just the trend. The trend in modernity is ugliness, subverting your expectations. We all kind of know what's beautiful. So let's take that and jack with it. That's sort of the approach. Um, and it's just the sort of thing that comes out of me when I'm writing is I love to like reject that in the most like purposeful ways. I'm like, no, 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 I will not subvert your
Right.
expectations. I will give you like
Hmm.
the hero of your dreams. However, he's going to be more than that. So sort of, I don't know. Part of my approach to art is reacting to some of the trends now in a purposeful way. But I love the idea of potentially modern Christianity in 2022, the American Christian church getting back in touch with like muscular Christianity, because I think that if there was this intentional movement that
Yeah.
gave men permission to be exceptional yet humble men, because I think there is like weird internal conflict over being exceptional in some ways. I think some men
Yeah.
push it away because they're afraid they're going to fail. I
Yeah.
think some men, it's the passivity thing.
Or we're uncomfortable with risk, where
Yeah,
risk is just so wonderful for development. I mean, I couldn't have a successful career. I
right.
definitely couldn't have a successful, the business that's thriving, or a marriage without that sense of risk. It's actually beautiful
Yeah,
when you take risk
yeah,
and you don't see it as a threat. I love that. I think that's
yeah,
fantastic. Yeah.
yeah. I
Because
think
I think
it.
it's in touch. If you can reframe risk as not something that is somehow a threat, but a reward to your stepping forward, I think that's great.
Yeah, yeah, man. You've filled my mind with a million little thoughts now, like the Lion King. I'm rethinking it all. Like I'm like, wow.
Right.
Also, because I don't know if you noticed, Scar is like a communist, so it all is
Oh,
making
yes,
perfect
he
sense.
is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
all
The whole
about
like
like,
walking. Oh, yeah.
mhm, yep,
Overly empathetic
be
and
prepared,
leaves.
like
Yeah. Be prepared. Yeah. Oh, gosh.
for
Yeah.
food shortages.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
that's a different podcast.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So,
Well, thanks, Peter. This was
yeah, this is
fun.
fun.
Like
Yeah.
like as I suspected, I haven't like I haven't landed on these easy conclusions. I feel like I never do when I'm talking to you, but I do feel enriched. I feel enlightened.
Oh, well, good.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
think
Well,
about.
this is what I do all day. I just like explore with people literally
Yeah,
all day. So
I
I
love it.
do better without like a rigid outline myself, and I
Yeah,
would just rather have a conversation with you.
yeah,
So I think I feel more in my element when we could just do that. So
yeah. Well,
that's
and
basically what I do for a living. So
thank you
yeah.
so much for reading After She Falls. It really does like touch me that you would read it. Like that's just very kind. You're a good friend. I appreciate that.
Well, I still haven't
Um
finished. I have to finish. So yeah, but I have read, yeah,
okay.
the gist. Yeah, the moving.
You get
I was like, are you serious? When I read the review, so I'm almost, yeah, I'll
you're almost there. You'll
almost there.
see. You'll see what happens. Well, I really appreciate you chatting. Let's do this again. I'm sure I'll think of I have another book coming out that
Yes.
has it will be potentially, I don't know if it's going to be more controversial or less, but I'm sure we'll have things to talk about.
I can't wait. Yeah.
That'll be the
Well,
guarantee.
I'm so excited for you. Yeah. Thanks, Carmen.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yes.
Okay. All right.